and the state of play of the entire West Asia region, as well as wider geostrategic concerns, have shifted drastically. Iran and Russia are out of play. A generally reviled regime in Syria has been ousted, and that's not CIA propaganda for those of you who think it is. And the future of Syria is uncertain. This has been an unfortunately divisive issue, but one thing we can all agree on is no one expected, even HTS, based on observable facts on the ground, that a nearly 200,000 man army with Russian air support would be defeated by small arms within a week, with very few actual engagements. We'll be getting into some fog of war theories about why that might have happened later, i.e. not fighting, receiving stand-down orders, desertion, etc. So I'm taking the L on that, and perhaps thinking that regime change wasn't a Western objective may have been pre-October 7th thinking, where U.S. policy was to, quote, accept the unacceptable when it came to Iran and its proxies, i.e. containment of an entrenched Assad regime, and also the former Mossad byline, better the devil you know than the demons you don't. However, this was a great opportunity for a land grab, and that's what the IDF is doing right now. Buffer zones. And as you know, I've resisted the narrative that this was all a Western-backed plot, mostly because it's reductive and robs the Syrian people of any agency or legitimate grievance against their government. Based on open source assessment, well, it was a doozy, the prediction that the Assad regime would be able to resist for months, or at least contain the advance into Aleppo. But these things do happen. So here's the ex-head of Mossad, Britain's foreign intelligence service, on that.
How much of a surprise?
Sorry, not Mossad, MI6. Britain's, okay. Woo, off to a crazy start.
Do you think this was to us, particularly our intelligence services?
Well, I think it was a surprise to everyone, Trevor. It probably came as a surprise to Tahrir al-Sham, the group you're calling HTS, which have been the main rebel group involved in this march on Damascus. I don't think they expected to go so far, so fast. I think we're all surprised at how the regime forces have just completely collapsed, even those most loyal to the regime and closest to the regime. So yes, it is a surprise. It's not a failure of intelligence. It's a surprise to everyone.
Do you think that, what did it tell us about, we've just been discussing the Russians and also the Turks. Do you detect the hand of Turkey in this?
Well, Turkey certainly has a close interest in this. The Tahrir al-Sham isn't the group that was closest to the Turks in terms of cooperation and training and supply, but Turkey has a very close interest. I think things have moved in a very favorable direction for Turkey, and I think they will be the most interesting and influential country in the region now as the various opposition groups come together to try to have a consensus about how a new regime comes into play.
Interesting that he is already preemptively calling whatever comes together a regime. But look, getting outside of the world of like the geopolitical issue and actually focusing on the people, I'm glad to see that the tone and emotion policing of Syrians over the fall of a violent dictator like Assad has died down. It was from the start divisive and unhelpful. Like, the true litmus test really was the unbelievably dismal performance of the Syrian Arab army on the battlefield, which showcased a total unwillingness to engage the adversary decisively, defend strategic positions, and was more concerned with standing down and deserting safely to Iraq than defending the capital, which they had managed to do during the last iteration of the war. And the political will was simply not there, not in the Syrian government, not in the Russian, Iranian governments, the military, the people, even in Assad himself. And propagandists, again, on mainstream media, were not even forecasting this lightning success. And they folded faster than the Afghan National Army to the Taliban. And I suspect that the Russians and the IRGC knew this would happen, given that the U.S. military, when I was in, knew that the ANA would instantly fold to the Taliban all the way back in 2009. So they cut their losses. So the ability of Iran and Russia to prop up a failing regime apparently exceeded capacity. At any rate, those who are saying that the axis of resistance is dead are perhaps being overtly gloomy about regional prospects. In the short term, a lot of people are concerned about chaos, the potential balkanization of Syria between competing geopolitical interests and expanding Israeli occupation. In the long term, though, no one really knows, but things will progress rapidly. And if you lament the triumph of imperialist forces in the region at this juncture, you must also recognize that Assad, all atrocities aside, was way too soft on the bourgeois and merchant classes within Syria, and could have tried to carry out popular economic and social reforms to have people feel more of a stake in the Syrian state. But he didn't, being a tyrant. Remember, he was in power for over a decade before the US began its maximum pressure sanctions on Syria. And there was an entire dynasty that could have eschewed corruption and cronyism, but it didn't. Again, history didn't start on October 7th, and it didn't start back in 2011 either. And I would say this is my didactic op-ed piece, that a collective liberation movement predicated on the oppression and displacement of so many millions probably isn't going to work out. And it certainly didn't in this case. It's true that the Palestinian cause is in a very bleak place at the moment. We'll soon see what the Syrian people have to say about that. And, you know, to really get into what's going on in Syria and the dynamics that, you know, we as outsiders who don't have much experience in the region want to get into, we're going to jump right in. So Afeef Nessouli is a freelance journalist and host with Afeef Nessouli on Patreon. He's also an adjunct professor for Parsons School of Design. He has previously worked for Spotify, The Daily Show, The Wall Street Journal. He focuses on queer and Arab stories. Afeef lived through the 2006 Lebanon War and went to prison in Beirut for covering Palestine. He was previously worked for the Carter Center on Syria and for the UN Special Rapporteur for the Committee Against Torture. You can find his work on social media. Thanks so much for coming on.
I appreciate you for having me, and that robust introduction was, like you said, robust. I appreciated it a lot.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a wild past week. I guess it's such a comprehensive.
Where do we start?
Yeah, where do we start? Okay, so you monitor like public discourse via social media. What do you think? First off, like people should understand about the current situation. The people aren't a monolith, but how are Syrian people, again, very multi-ethnic, cultural? How could you generalize what the emotion is?
Extremely diverse. A lot of POVs. I think that we always have to like buffer for that and talk about that, of course. With that being said, I think the news today about Sednaya prison and all these prisons being freed is a very good place to sort of start, because it kind of maps the trauma and the intense sort of memories and all of the rehabilitation and the sort of retribution that is going to kind of come to play in the next few weeks. And I think that's where I start, is that Syrians are, this is a historic day for a lot of Syrians who, for the last half century, have been under an Assad regime, and not just Bashar, but his father. And there was hope when Bashar came around for economic sort of reform, but it never came. There was corruption, nepotism, cronyism, like you said, bribery. There was a lot of things that were going on that limited Syrians, but on top of that, there was terror in his regime. So I think most Syrians right now, just to generalize, are feeling a sense of relief and worry of, you know, we've somehow taken down this behemoth, this forever dictator is finally gone. Now, what the hell comes next is something that I don't think anyone can really like pinpoint. And so I think that that is worrisome for minorities, and even for Sunnis who are not extremely conservative per se, are looking at HTS and are like, okay, well, what's going to be next? And I think so they're balancing a lot of incredible relief and a lot of worry as well.
Would you say that that's where most of the concern is coming from? Like, what will be the nature of this new government under HTS, which has such a colorfully problematic history, to say the least?
Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of the worry now is chaos too. I think like there is this window of time where this regime is out and the infrastructure is still sort of there, but it's been hollowed by years of cronyism and corruption. So it's kind of weak. Like you said, the army totally gave up. So places like Damascus and Aleppo and all of these places, like I think people were bracing, and it hasn't really come. So I think that that's really positive for chaos. And I think that there's going to be an amount of chaos that you can't really like control, because there are different groups. There's a lot of different groups. And then there's also just young men who haven't been working, for literally, like, I think one of the statistics I read was, from 2006 to 2011, there was a huge drought and a lot of young men didn't have jobs. There's a lot of information coming out. And when you have that kind of dynamic, you have a lot of people who are now extremely excited in the streets, having a lot of like relief from this dictator who literally had his thumb on every single person. Like, you were afraid of your neighbors, like afraid of even family members to rat you out if you didn't like the regime or said something. So now there's this bracing for chaos. Like, what kind of is Syria without the Assad regime containing every corner into like little boxes? What does that world look like? I think that they're literally living it out every second as it passes, as sort of experiencing a whole new system and a whole new dynamic.
Right. And there are sectarian clashes. What I've been tracking and hearing most about is the Syrian National Army, the one group that's more demonstrably backed by Turkey than anyone else, clashing with the Kurds, the Syrian Defense Force, over because I do think Turkey wants to create more of a buffer zone, especially like with regards to the Kurds. And so we're seeing that happen. But have you been hearing about any other clashes within the cities?
I think that I have heard of a few, but I think the thing that I'm hearing the most is the lack, like the hope for the fact that there hasn't been as many as expected. I think the Kurds are a particular case because they've gained more ground. Turkey's on their butts. Like, they don't want to be bordering this Kurdish nation that has all of this oil that Trump is saying, we want the oil. And so there's these considerations that are happening that I think that for the loyalists who like all went to Latakia and Tartus, like there's possibly, I think that there's definitely sectarian clashes, and they're going to continue. I think that there's a lot of trauma here, a lot of retribution and revenge is probably happening. But I don't think that I have not heard an overwhelming story of like what you might expect. And that could change. That also might not be being reported very well. I think most Syrians are like in the narrative that actually it's not so bad yet. And what we're doing right now is celebrating, and we're holding a moment for hope. Like, we're holding a moment for like this resistance to the Assad regime. And we're holding this moment, this window of time right now of feeling positive despite the amount of like, the likelihood of things going left any second, I think. So what have you heard exactly other than the army and the Kurds? Has there been other stuff that you've heard?
Well, I know for a fact that the U.S. Air Force,
right?
I'm not sure about the U.S. Special Operations community, because there are JSOC guys, operators inside the AANES.
Rojava.
But I don't know about any special operations raid into ISIS territory, but there are definitely massive airstrikes happening there.
Yeah, they've hit like 70 places or 70 targets or something like that, or maybe over that of ISIS. I think I was in Ain al-Helwa, which is a huge refugee camp in Lebanon, about a month and a half ago, right before everything's like right in September, actually. And it's December. I can't believe how many months it's been. But when I was there were flags of ISIS being hoisted up in parts of the camp where like that's not normal. And even in September, I was wondering, is there going to be a Syrian storyline kind of coming to the top? And I posted about it on my stories. I definitely limited it because taking a picture of that flag was really dangerous. And just going through the camp, it's not Lebanese jurisdiction. It's under the different factions. Like Hezbollah has one area, Fatah, Hamas, and then there's really radical right-wing extremists in that camp. And in that corridor where I was in, there were a couple flags. And it was just one of those things, as a Lebanese person, I was like, that's not normal. Like that's new. And so I think like ISIS, there is this worry that in this chaos, really right-wing extremists will kind of take the advantage because we know that they have relationships. WikiLeaks has done a lot of work to tell us about how the US and Israel are extremely like they benefit from a destabilized Syria. They've worked with radicals before. ISIS has like 2,500 people right now. They could grow. They might not grow because maybe HTS is a really good alternative that's not as right wing, and it's kind of giving the same sort of Sunni, the same sort of Sunni value system in some ways. And I don't want to like call them. I don't want to call ISIS Muslim, but this concept that they're the sectarian force to be reckoned with. Well, the U.S. is bombing them, and it seemed like they had been growing in some ways, and now there's this dynamic in Syria that could give them more room, and they are by far very different than any of these other groups, right? Like they are extreme in ways that I think we can worry about HTS becoming. But the way that HTS has sort of forwarded itself, it's trying to say it's changed a lot. So I think right now, like the chaos window is one we're in, and we just don't know what happens next.
Right. And with regards to HTS, the second they started having political aspirations, they did this whole campaign to distance themselves from Al Qaeda and the Islamic State. However, their leader, al-Jolani, he was literally a deputy for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which is crazy.
Yeah. He started Nusra, right? Like I've interviewed these guys. I spent some time on the Syrian border in Lebanon and in prisons with these two social workers, and I've done a lot of work with really right-wing extremists. They're the same people. It's like Trumpism. It's like it's an ism. When I say they're the same people, I mean like the concept that this guy has changed a lot is definitely politics to me. Like I don't see how he could have really shifted. I think politics is a really good motivation to change, actually. I think a lot of groups have done that before. That's an important factor to weigh. Like him having a political shift and stance, understanding the pragmatism could be a good thing. It has to be a good thing, because him being connected to Al-Qaeda or like Nusra is ISIS. That's ISIS like level caliphate. That's like really impossible behavior to sort of negotiate with. Like there's nothing you can do with that.
Right. So, I mean, the U.S. is conducting strikes to contain ISIS in the pockets that it exists in. For some of the viewers, nobody in the region, not the Arab League, not the Gulf states, not the U.S. who have the oil, we're guarding the oil. They don't want ISIS to start like overrunning those sites, which we have vested interests in like retaking Raqqa or whatever. So the vested interest in having perhaps contained chaos, but not like the stuff we saw during the first iteration of this war. So
yeah, so you're gonna. To me, I think that we use ISIS as like a big weapon to say, the Middle East is crazy, and we need to be there, and we need to, control things. The truth is HTS is going to have to court all of these superpowers, because they probably got a little help, and they're still going to need help. There's a lot of reconstruction, a lot of rebuilding that's going to have to happen. So it's interesting because I think HTS and Jolani, by the way, he's like in his 40s. He went to an American prison. Like he can't be pro-America. Like if he's courting America, it's like, because he like understands that there's some larger vision, that he like needs money to like rebuild stuff and like work. But he was in a prison. I mean, the stories you hear from Iraq and Syria and just the trauma of young men during the Iraq war is like why ISIS exists. So like right-wing extremism or right-wing Sunni like Islam didn't exist because of that. But ISIS as a group became extremely popular because a lot of men had been traumatized and tortured by the entire American sort of presence during that time. And so I think what's interesting now is HTS comes from that ilk of men, but is doing this thing that even Hezbollah did from the 80s, which is that they governmentalize. They like figure out that they need to do other things really quick. So you can look at HTS as where they were governing in northwest Syria. And there was the SSG. They're like representatives of something called the SSG. It's not a great, I mean, I don't think their governance is great. They like had
it's
taxes.
For the audience. Sorry,
Yeah,
for the audience,
yeah.
that's the like transliterates to the Syrian Salvation Government.
Yeah.
So it's inherently religious.
Yeah. technocratic. It's like a caliphate of like in some ways. I think that Christians and minorities in under HTS will be able, like there is a world where they like create a Muslim sort of we say caliphate, but maybe it will be something else, something lesser than a caliphate. But there are ways in which minorities can be okay. There are ways in which that this can work out. But I think when you look at the SSG and you understand that they were like governing 4 million people or something in 2023 already, they had like systems. They weren't great. Like people were living in bad conditions, and there was like, there were taxes and there was subsidies coming from the government, but it's not like the governing structure was great. They're going to need to collaborate, and they're going to need a lot of money, which means that whatever comes up in the next few weeks is unknown, because it's going to be like, who's giving them aid? Like, how is the US and Europe coming in and giving them aid? And what does that look like? And what is that money? Or if it's coming from Qatar or wherever it's coming from, does that money, Turkey, what does that money have, what's the word? Like strings attached. And what do those strings become?
Right. And so we could definitely like shift to outside interference. Before we get into that, Syria has been at the mercy of great power politics for a very, very long time. How concerned, I wouldn't try to rank it, but like how aware and conscious and concerned are a plurality of people in Syria about Western and even like renewed Russian or Iranian interference?
I think like when you think of the Syrian experience, I think it becomes like you get into sectarianism, because I think like these superpowers have this 1 or 2 steps removed, and then they have these proxies that like really represent them and like are the personhood of the, you know what I mean? Like if you're Hezbollah and you're walking around Syria as a Shiite militant coming from Iran or coming from Lebanon or coming from Iraq, what you are to these people in Syria are like another sect with a gun who's kind of occupying this area. So like we are very aware of Hezbollah's force and formidability against Israel. And that is one narrative that is true. And that when we say force, we don't mean that they beat them, but just the fact that they were up and fighting for a year and have done a very, I guess, a job that no one else would do, right? Not many people else would do. And they, in some ways, did their best and did a pretty good job given what the differentials in power. But to people in Syria, that's not what Hezbollah is. Like Hezbollah is something else. It's a narrative that's more local. It's that they're, walking around. So Hezbollah becomes a representative of Iran. I think the dynamic that was in Syria was so bad that I think most people are like, at least now there's a new dynamic. And Iran and Russia, Russia is also doing a lot of imperialistic stuff in Syria. So it's like when you think of anti-imperialism, it's really like hard to pick a side, because actually every side in the Arab world usually is getting patronage from outside forces that are usually imperialistic, whether they're Turkey or Iran, more local, or far away like the US or Europe. The ultimate thing is that the way Syrians look at it, or any Arab might look at it, is that on the ground, you're experiencing the representatives of these superpowers, these proxies. And so that could look like a Shiite fighter with Hezbollah. It could look like ISIS that looks, that's being funded by some outside source. Maybe it's a CIA situation or
Saudi.
Qatar. Yeah, Saudi. Like you can tell that like men with guns are not just local. They go from local guys with money coming from somewhere and some agenda. And so I think that, I speak with reasonability here, because there's a lot of different kinds of men with guns doing this kind of stuff. And so it runs the gamut with sectarianism. But the fact that there are not pro-Assad regime checkpoints and prisons and fearing for your own sort of safety every minute of your life is I think, it's obviously an improvement. So that's where I think the superpower relationship, like when you're thinking about what Syrians think of superpowers, they're probably aware that HTS couldn't have done this without some outside help. They're probably aware that Israel is going to try its best to like come in, do what Israel does, and do what it was doing before while Assad was there anyways, which is occupy, strike. They're aware of the fragile balance that they're on and what all the players are. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's so complicated. It's hard to like feel satisfied.
Right. No. And also, everyone has their own opinion about this stuff. But I have the Syrians that I have been talking to over the past few days. They would definitely be like, okay, now Iran's gone. Now Russian imperialists are gone. Now we only have NATO, Turkey, and a guy said a term that's been cropping up more, neo-Ottoman.
Neo-Ottoman is real. That is, yeah, totally.
And then, of course, the U.S. is always going to be there, and Israel's always going to be there. But I think the impression I've had with who I've talked to is like, Assad gone, awesome. Russia gone, awesome. Iran gone, awesome. Who's next? So there's, and I know a lot of my more left-wing friends would be like, based on theory, Russia is not capable of imperialism. I was like, well, I did my military service in Central Asia. There's a bunch of Uzbeks and Tajiks and Kazakhs who would disagree with you.
Totally. I mean, it's a different, it looks different, but it is really just imperialism. I mean, they did a lot of work.
So there's some elation over that. I know, I know, of course, HTS could go either way. They could either try to be more accepted politically, like the Taliban have tried to rebrand in Afghanistan, for instance. They're struggling to do that, but they're making an effort. So maybe we could see that from HTS, or they could double down. But since we've talked about that, I was hoping to move on to something that's, of course, existed in the region forever, and that's Western interference. Here's Biden's remarks.
The Middle East. After 13 years of civil war in Syria, more than half a century of brutal authoritarian rule by Bashar Assad and his father before him, rebel forces have forced Assad to resign his office and flee the country. We're not sure where he is, but there's word that he's in Moscow. We will engage with all Syrian groups, including within the process led by the United Nations, to establish a transition away from the Assad regime toward independent, sovereign, independent, I want to say it again, sovereign Syria, with a new constitution, a new government that serves all Syrians. And this process will be determined by the Syrian people themselves. And the United States will do whatever we can to support them. We will remain vigilant. Make no mistake, some of the rebel groups that took down Assad have their own grim record of terrorism and human rights abuses.
He, of course, it's important to point out that he never has explicitly named HTS as that.
We've taken note of statements by the leaders of these rebel groups in recent days, and they're saying the right things now. But as they take on greater responsibility, we will assess not just their words, but their actions.
So as someone who is kind of on the spear tip of imperialism, this kind of sets the door, the framework for intervention later on.
Right.
So how concerned are people about this?
Yeah, I think Biden is trying to take credit. Israel's trying to take credit. I think that the U.S. has shaped the modern way the world works right now for a while, obviously. I mean, if we look at the Middle East through the lens of the West, it's a battlefield of oil and natural gas to them, right? And I think for a lot of people in Syria, there is a legitimate narrative that the American strategy for years has been to destabilize it and to really work with forces in Syria for their own benefit rather than the benefit of Syria itself, even if that means Syrians are in cahoots. They're not necessarily aware of what the agenda is. And the agenda has been to destabilize the country for long enough to make it a non-factor for Iran or make it a non-factor for Russia, whether it's stealing bases from Russia or taking them back, just cornering Russia off the map. I think ultimately, though, we know that there have been cables from WikiLeaks that suggest that basically the U.S. has been trying to undermine Assad for a really long time. I mean, the problem with the U.S. is that they have presidents like Biden who can't even say Bashar al-Assad's name correctly. Like, if you can't even say his name correctly, I don't mean that as there's no jest here. Like, he said Bashir. Like, it's one of those things. It's like you have so much power and no understanding or knowledge of like the Syrian sort of street. So with that much power and so much influence, without having any actual authentic understanding of what's going on, you get a bunch of chaos because the destabilizing is the goal. It's not destabilizing for some certain agenda. I don't think the U.S. can govern Arabs the way that people assume. Like, I think we might take their money for our agenda, but I think historically it's not very easy to put a puppet regime that's just going to work and do everything for the US, and it's just going to be like really soft and easy. So I do think people are a little worried. I think they're worried that HTS might, normalize with Israel, and that suddenly Palestine is again totally left out by all of the Arabs again, and that the US will have their arms on these Sunnis that are, taking power from years of being marginalized, and that radical anger from these guys that were imprisoned or not given any voice is going to lead them to make friendships with a neo-Ottoman local ruler who has a US backing. And yeah, there's a lot of reason to be afraid that the fact that HTS is just like not the group to understand how to like both court superpowers, but also like keep them at bay. So yeah, it's like, I think that's a major concern right now. Like you said, Iran is out, Russia's out, Syria, Hezbollah's out, and Assad is out. But like, what about the rest of the cohorts of Turkey, who's now got a lot of power, the US, who's got a lot more power, Israel, who's definitely going to benefit from this? We're not done with those superpowers kind of meddling, for sure.
Right. And so I guess the normalization is like a big concern within the context of, I would say, Lebanon and especially Palestine. So with Lebanon, the U.S. Well, let's start there. The U.S. is trying to prop up the Lebanese government and embed itself in that, and embed itself in the military. We're going to start sending advisors. We're going to start trying to get the Lebanese military up to snuff where they could maybe challenge in 15 years Hezbollah. It's a stretch goal,
I don't think that they have the will. I don't know if Lebanese people, I'm Lebanese, I don't know. We don't have it in us. Hezbollah has it in them. They have a reason to be there and reason to be pissed. And I don't know. We'll see about the alien. But sorry, go ahead.
No, and so they're building that monstrosity, that new embassy monstrosity in Beirut, which is kind of a really monarchical symbol of power. It's okay, guys, you can be more subtle if you want. So they're going to try to get the Lebanese government more powerful politically, for Hezbollah. Also, now that the axis of resistance pipeline from Iran, through Iraq, through Syria to Lebanon is gone, they basically consider Hezbollah off the board, at least as a regionally for the moment. And now Palestine is kind of isolated. And this was a big concern for a lot of people in the outside world. And even though Hamas gave out a statement today saying we completely support the Syrian people's right to self-determination, good that Assad's gone, free Syria, and then hopefully free Palestine. Essentially, I'm really paraphrasing here.
Totally.
But yeah, what's the concern in Syria about what will happen in Palestine and Lebanon? And is this seen as a connected struggle, again, in general terms?
I think that we would be naive to think that a bunch of Sunni rebels who just took down Assad aren't for the Palestinian cause, no matter what they say. I think that they probably are. I think most Arabs look at Palestine and think that, it's clear, there's an oppressor. They've been butchering Palestinians for a long time. I think that the fact of the matter is that these Sunni rebels and Hamas have more in common than Hezbollah and Hamas did. And I think that that's hard for us as an American group here to see because of the news and the fact that, these rebels are definitely going to be we have no problem with Israel, because they cannot open up a front with Israel right now. That is not what they're trying to do. They're trying to stabilize the country and figure out what the hell comes next. I think in the future, the problem for Lebanon is actually, if you have a really right-wing Sunni government, I think what happens then is trying to prop up the Sunnis in Lebanon, consolidate power, and understand that actually this very diverse country on your border is now more right-wing and more conservative than it was. Maybe less violent and less totalitarian, we'll see. But that consideration, I think, is more pressing to Lebanon and Palestine. And I think that there's opportunity in that. And there's also problems with that. So the opportunity there is that actually like Hamas and the Syrian rebels were both fighting like dictators that didn't care about them at all. And now there's going to be, like you said with Hamas, they came out and were like, no, we like support this, like whatever the people want, like that's the point. And I think now we have to wait on what HTS says. Though I think HTS is going to say a lot of things to get a lot of support and to consolidate their rule and their ability to have a coalition government. But I think, yes, Israel is going to take advantage. On Sunday, their troops had entered the buffer zone in the Golan Heights. They ordered a curfew on Syrian villages. Netanyahu said he was deploying there temporarily. But I think that Israel was doing a lot of stuff under Assad, and Assad wasn't doing much for the Palestinians except for being like, honestly, like Hezbollah, like come through, like you guys can come through the corridor. I think that they really did help the Iranians, give them weapons. We know that. But I think ultimately he didn't do as much. I mean, they were genocided under his, watch too. So it's not as though Assad was some pro-resistance, anti-imperialist hero on any level. Like I think,
in fact, the Houthis have called Ansar Allah have called him out on that a number of times.
Yeah. He was just political. It was politically convenient. He backed Iran over the Iraq-Iran war in the 80s and had to stick with his decision since then, and had Iran, that was his ally. And so he did exactly what Iran wanted. Iran is fighting Israel. I don't know that Assad was fighting Israel. And I think now that Assad is gone, there's a lot of questions, but I don't know that the Palestinians are worse off. They're as bad as possible. So I think like they
weren't getting any political cover or weapons in anyways. I mean,
no, they weren't. So I think that don't quote me on this, but I'm not going to use hopeful. I don't know what word to use, but I can see a reality where the rebels who are, taking up this coup d'etat, this rebellion, look at Palestine and say, we're like, that is a goal. Like our goal there remains. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to try to like bring a lot of attention. They're not trying to open up a front, but I can't imagine that Sunni rebels are somehow against Hamas, who are also, rebels from a Sunni background and have a religious sort of slant and have local, very territorial, local, not internationalist goals that are similar. So, my hot take is that it's not as bad as we think. It could actually be more of a problem for Israel than we can see right now.
Well, I mean, the problems for Israel have multiplied over the past year in a way that I had never, ever expected. And like a lot of people are saying this is a blow to, the ongoing violence in Palestine. But if you haven't been paying attention, it would have still continued no matter what. Yeah. One thing we're seeing now, and I just want to point this out for the audience, what Afeef was saying about HTS not responding or posing a military threat is precisely why Israel is bombing the hell out of Syria, out of Damascus, specifically any sort of military sites with any sort of high-tech equipment, any sort of military capacity for the incoming government to be able to defend itself. All they have are small arms. They're losing all their air defense capabilities, so they'll be completely open to Israeli airstrikes. They will not be able to challenge any other potential sectarian violence that might crop up. So how do they don't have like a technological advantage or an equipment advantage over anyone that could pop up. So this is potentially could be interpreted as a way to fend off a future attack from whatever incoming government is in Syria, and also a way to make sure that the incoming government in Syria can't defeat anyone else decisively that might crop up in, the next few months, years, or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's really on point, because I think Israel is going to do, we all know Israel is going to do whatever it can do to self-protect, even when that means Holocaust and other people. So right now it's just doing the same thing it always does. It's self-protecting. It's saying, let me get it while the getting's good. And, we don't know who these guys are. Jolani was in an American prison. He was in Al-Qaeda. Like, there's no way he's like suddenly going to be like, yeah, Israel's our friend. Like, I mean, he might say it. We might even be like shocked that this becomes something that gets more and more reported on. But I can't imagine a world where there's normalization in a way that doesn't. I'm hoping that is not something that there's a world where like there's normalization that just leaves out the Palestinians. I think that would be extremely anti-Islamic. I think that would be kind of corrosive to their legitimacy. And I think that it would be just kind of antithetical to like their vibe. They're rebels who took down a dictator. So,
they're now, according to like CNN, blazer wearing rebels.
Yeah, I'm dead. The U.S. media is going to do whatever it can to make HTS seem normal, because they like we've got to we've got to decide: are they going to be normal and we're going to take them off the terrorist list, or are they like the new enemy and we're going to invade? And I think we'll see what happens.
I think based off Biden's speech, we're clearly keeping both options open.
Totally.
Because CNN did a interview with Jolani, who has a massive $10 million bounty on his head or something like that.
100%.
Yeah. And just so everybody knows, CNN works with American intelligence services to set the news agenda for the United States. So it was most likely facilitated and approved of by three-letter agency,
100%.
you know who. So basically, what we can determine based off of past history is the wait and see approach. Are we going to go in? Are we not? We don't want to go in, but we will if we have to, which is slightly more calibrated. I mean, it's bad, but it's slightly more calibrated than Israel, who's like, we need to create a massive buffer zone and never leave.
Yeah, right.
Which is, they're going to entrench and they're going to settle. And yeah, I can't imagine that will endear themselves to the local population in Syria as well.
Yeah, it's not going to do that. I mean, right now there's a lot of groups, and HTS has to. It's going to have to command the respect of people who are not looking for a caliphate, people who are not necessarily looking for a place where minorities can't be fully supported. So I think that is the mentality he understands, or else I think we would be looking at a different situation right now. And I think like ultimately HTS, in my view, is doing whatever it can to keep all the options open, and everybody else is looking at them and understanding that and keeping the options open right now. And I think that's actually scary, because you just don't know who they are actually and what they might become. But I mean, they have given Turkey is now the winner of this little situation. Turkey becomes the winner. Whatever Turkish sort of foreign policy goals exist are going to be sort of like the presiding ones for now. I think it's interesting that Turkey did this, because it kind of means maybe Turkey and Russia are no longer in cahoots. What does that look like?
Well, I mean, they have to always be in cahoots, because they do agree on some other things in terms of policy. They do have a tumultuous history. Turkey, as of right now, says that like Crimea belongs to Ukraine, but they are a regional power that's very close to Russia. They'll, and then again, I just wanted to say at the end, we won't get into in this episode, but maybe next episode, like a lot of like backroom deal stuff seems to have happened that could have been at play. Assad, didn't he just do a massive tour of the Arab League as well? So that's a major influence. Also, Trump is incoming as the president. He wants to end the war. Maybe potentially, this is just a hypothetical. Russia would surrender a footprint in West Asia and then be able to keep like the Donbass or something in Ukraine. Right. Also, Iran, it is the champion of the axis of resistance, but it is still a government responsible for itself and its own people. And the new president, Pezeshkian, has telegraphed that he wants a better relationship with the West. And also he wants a relief of sanctions. He wants to see if what he can get from Trump. One of the main reasons Operation True Promise 3 hasn't happened yet. So there's a lot of things going on around this as well. And the entire dynamic has completely changed in a matter of weeks, in a matter of a week. And it's completely wild.
It's totally wild. And I think that, economics, not to be like an essentialist person and speak generally, but like economics kind of drive things. Like Iran needs money. Like Iran, yeah, its economy has been better than it was, I think, from reading, but it's like bad and it's been struggling. And I think that essentially, like
it's been able to resist the sanctions, but like nobody wants maximum pressure sanctions.
no, it makes the whole of your strategy or economic strategy just like there's a whole elephant on sitting on top of you. Like you have to like do so much working around it and going through other things. And I don't know. I'm hopeful that this takedown of Assad can really shake stuff up and put the Middle East back into the like sort of power, into the hands of, the majority, the collective, which I think Syria is giving a lot of hope. Like it's giving me a lot of hope to imagine that like resisting works and that actually essentially, you can dream for long enough and do the thing that you need to do to take down the brutal dictator. And now we're just sort of at a state building situation. It's like, does it go civil war? Does it go state building? And I think with
does it
that,
go puppet government?
Does it go puppet government completely? Yeah, puppet government completely is just an awful thing to think about because it's possible, but Jolani just doesn't seem like he's going to go down that way, but I could just be wrong. Like, what do you think about him being sort of doing that?
It takes a certain person to like join up with the Islamic State and work directly under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Yeah. But it could be just like a sociopath and be like, okay, I don't do head choppings anymore. I do political power and self-aggrandizement and stuff. Yeah. That's, and if it serves the people, so be it. But I don't know. As an outsider, like I don't really have any emotional beyond basic human empathy attachment to Syria. I almost fought in Syria when I was in special operations, but I got out because honestly, the whole war made me uncomfortable.
Really? Yeah.
And I also got into college at the time. But beyond that, yeah, he's just not a guy I would trust, even because like the people who are like championing the fall of Assad and the U.S. intelligence apparatus are not hopeful for him either.
No, it's not. This is about like, listen, if this person was in an American prison, worked with Baghdadi, started Nusra Front, like this man is angry, has like an extreme agenda in the name of God. There's supremacy here. Like literally, like you can just like sort of siphon things out that are similar to Israel. Like, why is ISIS in Israel? Why are ISIS and Israel similar? They're both colonizers. They're both imperialists. They both think that they're, God's chosen. They think that they have a reason on earth to create a kingdom that is for their people only. I think if a guy comes from that kind of mentality, he's ungovernable. But I also kind of think that he could be like a political mastermind, like not necessarily a sociopath, but someone who's like, all right, like I am angry and I believe in all this stuff, but this isn't going to work. Like ISIS really shat the bed last time. Like they got totally beaten. We need to do something different than that. And he said publicly that he's not for international violence or global jihadi violence. I think he's very territorially focused right now. And I think that bodes well because what we need is HTS to not have the biggest voice. We just need them to be one of the voices because what we don't want to admit is that with democracy in the Middle East, you get a lot of religiosity. People are generally more conservative than in the West. And if they were to choose something, it's like in Egypt, like Morsi came to power for a reason. Like people do vibe with right-wing culture, so yeah. It's not just Muslims. Like there are Christians who are right-wing too. Like there are like most people are more religious there than here. So yeah, I imagine that he's going to have to be pragmatic. He's being pragmatic now. So it seems like he's pragmatic now. I assume that it's kind of like momentum. It's just going to be the same as we see. Like I think the last few days, there was a lot of opportunity for us to see Christians coming out and being like, we are being terrorized. Like these rebels are so crazy. They're so scary. They're not letting us leave our houses without hijab. Like those stories have not been overwhelming from my reading and from my connections and my sources. So with that, all I read from that is a pragmatism that could in the end
be completely reversed as they solidify power.
That's not a lie.
Yeah.
Not a lie. Like, could be completely reversed. Completely.
No,
You're right.
But I mean, I definitely did want to do this episode because like so much in our space that was like pro-Palestine is just like really unnecessarily like doom and gloom. And I think a lot is being missed, especially like actual Syrian voices and people with actual like a ton of experience in the region that weren't necessarily pro-Assad, because enough people hated that guy to have a flawless, well, not flawless, but like one of the easiest coups I've ever seen.
So, yeah, I think that people in the West who have come to understand Palestine don't realize how much even those who are a part of the resistance access are a part of the problem too. Like, the Palestinian people in Gaza are not a part of the problem. Maybe some of the representation and the leadership can be, but certainly Assad and Iran are big parts of a problem here. Like, they're not great governors in their own countries. They're terrible governors of their own countries. So them taking up the mantle of Palestine is both convenient for them, and also we should always allow ourselves to criticize men in power wherever they come from. And I think ultimately, if you have a read on the Middle East, you understand that like you got to keep your political cheering for the people, and like that's it. And like everyone else, as the moment they like have a sort of gun or a political title, they're up for criticism. And that includes our faves. You know what I mean? That includes your faves. That includes everybody. Because if you're not doing that, the problem for Arabs becomes, for people like me who are citizens of the region, is that the governors are bad and we didn't criticize them enough. And if there was more political voicing from people who, there might be some refining. And I think that that's important. So, people understood Assad is bad and Palestine should be free. Like, you can have those two feelings can exist at once.
Yeah. And, I definitely am hopeful for the region, for Syria, but I do understand people's pessimism. I mean, I know my government and I know what they're willing to do, having seen it to like firsthand, mostly in Afghanistan. And so, hopefully they're able to resist Western interference and whatever else is happening. And of course, Israel is going to remain a problem on the border. Like the fact that they're like taking so much land for a buffer zone, like the Golan Heights is already a friggin' buffer zone.
Yeah, they're just like a made-up nation who's doing whatever it can to keep getting more land before they eventually get what's coming to them, which is that these settler colonial nations can't, especially in the Middle East, like it doesn't have like regional support. It doesn't have, now internationally, it looks so terrible in the last year. Not that it didn't look better before, but a lot of people are now clued in. Yeah, Israel's just fake, and it's going to do whatever it can to keep in compensation of its fakeness and its settler colonialist like dynamic. It's going to do whatever it can to get more land before it gets less land. And I think I am not hopeful for this getting any easier for a while, but in the long run, in the long arc of justice and on the long arc of resistance, what we need to do is make it expensive for our countries to be doing the wrong thing, like to be warmongering, to be at war. Like we as citizens and people in the resistance, whether they're in America or the resistance in the Arab world, whatever you think of as resistance, ultimately it means not letting them hold any ground. And it also means making shit expensive. That is what resisting looks like to me, is like making what you can expensive for those who are imperialists so that they lose money imperializing, and also not allowing them to hold ground, which for us looks like making it expensive and making them lose stake, lose monopolies. I think in the Arab world that looks different. And, I won't comment on the resistance there because I'm here.
Yeah. Well, there was a cultural shakeup recently. in Manhattan. Was it Tribeca where the CEO got shot?
It was. I thought it was no. It was near Central Park. It was
because he disappeared in Central
yeah,
Park.
and now he's Luigi. Luigi has been named. This happened.
And I do think this is an important dynamic when it comes to the overall system, because we've been seeing a massive spike in class consciousness where like leftists were looking at libertarians and libertarians were like looking at conservatives and being like, huh?
Like Spider-Man.
Yeah. And of course, now that we saw instant results, right? The Blue Cross Blue Shield repealed one of their more abhorrent abhuman policies. So what Palestine has done is kind of like woken so many people up to the reality of their material existence within this like capitalist, and therefore imperialist, increasingly fascist system.
Yeah.
So,
and we don't necessarily even have the worst of it, because the US obviously is way worse to outsiders and the way it imperializes other groups outside of the US. But there is no clearer takeaway from this last year than the late stage capitalists having robbed us of everything and trying to feed us a marketing plan where we're just killing, like where they're just sort of, their agenda is to make us convinced that their corporate sort of world view is good for us. I think in the last year, we've just realized, like with Palestine, that we've been tortured and abused, and we saw it in a sort of manifestation with Palestine that is undeniable.
Yeah. And it's basically been a massive education for everybody. We usually do a Q&A, but we might have to skip. Well, we got a couple minutes left. Someone said,
talk too much.
I know. Bashir was a great doctor on DS9. Yeah, that guy on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Yeah, that guy's cool. Okay. One guy's like, I'm out to gray zone. Peace out. Wish you guys were right, but I don't see the optimism. Where's your revolutionary optimism, man? What's up? Like, you don't like Ho Chi Minh? Like, come on.
Yeah, I think like if you can't muster revolutionary strength when things are hard, then you might not be a revolutionary.
Yeah, but you can go be sad at Gray Zone. I mean, I do watch that, but like it's all like doom and gloom. There's like anyways, that's not what I'm trying to do. That's not been my platform since the beginning of the genocide.
What's the point of doom and gloom? We've got to build some sort of new dynamic. We don't have to be, toxically positive by any means, but we need to build new things.
Yeah, because being pessimistic, while it's not naive, it's also not entirely sustainable for the amount of years this is going to keep going on.
Right. You have to be hard, and hard sometimes means having faith in something that's larger and more important than your own mood right now. And if you speak to Palestinians, you'll get a great lesson in how that works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because they've had to learn it over generations. And so
they are the model of incredible resilience. And I hate that word, of course, but they're the model of incredible strength. And they have faith in every conversation I have with them. I say them as in they're all the same. They're not. But one thing that many of them have in common is an absolute, the principle of steadfastness is real. And being steadfast doesn't mean being, a moody bitch, to be honest. Sorry to cuss.
It's fine. It's only in the first 6 minutes of YouTube that the algorithm really censors.
Got it.
We're way past that. And again, also, the Palestinian resistance has endorsed the fall of Assad government. And for all you that were like, I take my orders from the resistance. Well, that's what they're doing. And they're going to be the ones continuing to fight and die in Gaza and in the West Bank. So we're if you're going to take your orders from HQ, there it is.
There it is.
And we'll see how this thing unfolds. It could go any number of ways, which we've talked about. And thank you so much for coming on, Afeef Nessouli. It was great talking to you, and I'm glad.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you so much and all the work you're doing. So thank you for having me.
All right, y'all, this has been State of Play on MintPress News. We will be back Wednesday or Thursday, depending on this insane news cycle. Hope you have a great night, and we will link Afeef's stuff in the description. All right, cheers, y'all.